Lacey up the middle. Lacey's in the clear. It's a foot race. The Hurricanes cannot run him down. A lightning strike for Ole Miss. Tony has space. Malachi Tony still running. Touchdown Miami. Electric with the ball in his hands.
We're back, the CFF Sites preseason show, and we're talking risers and fallers with my partner, Mike Bainbridge. My name's Joe DeSalvo, and Mike, the third of another three-part series. We've done sleepers, we've done players that were fading, and now we kind of get into risers and fallers, and I really like this one, particularly this time of the year as we're a couple of weeks from the start of the season. So I think this is really helpful for people going into having their drafts in the last couple of weekends of the preseason, which is what I highly recommend. You want to get as much intel and player news as possible before your college fantasy football drafts, but also gives the guys the pulse of some players that and news of where trends are if you've had some early drafts. Guys that you may want to be a little bit more cautious about, or guys that you may want to put on your radar that could be trending upwards when we're talking rises and fallers, right?
Yeah, and this will include some player news in this one that we've uncovered from the last 1 or 2 weeks here with fall camps opening up.
Yeah, and I think it's important to note too, and I think we should throw this out by the time this show airs. I mean, we're recording this on Wednesday, August 12th, right? And earlier, just a little while ago, we were hit with the news about Jordan Davison, the running back from Oregon, about whether or not there is a shoulder injury there. You know, there's some conflicting reports out there, but like, just remember De'Aaron Hill and Jordan Davison, right? Because those are two names we'd probably be discussing a little bit more in depth if we had a little bit more context around this news. But there's nothing concrete out there, so we just want to throw that out there as we start this show, right? Because by the time this airs and we get it uploaded onto the site, we may get some more clarity around that.
We'll probably get news that's from some other team. That's just how fall camps and this time of year is. We are constantly updating the guide. We're constantly updating our cheat sheets and rankings. That is just that time of year.
So, like, let's start it off, man. Risers, fallers. Give us a name of where you're at right now, one way or the other.
Yeah, Trey Richardson was one that is a riser for me, and it really started at the onset of the summer when, you know, Jeff Brom started meeting with the media and some of the players started meeting with the media. And he said that Trey Richardson is either at 100% or close to 100%. I forget the exact quote there, but the fact that Trey Richardson's out there, he is participating in fall camp and apparently looking the part is why he is steadily rising across draft boards. We obviously know the Jeff Brom wide receiver 1 has been immensely successful over the past few seasons. I think, let's see, was it 98 or more targets in 7 of the last 8 years from the wide receiver 1 under Jeff Brom. Now, it's been the boundary, the outside wide receiver that's been the top guy typically, but you know, all reports seem to indicate that Richardson is the guy this year, probably starting in the slot though. And there was a recent quote that our friend at Fantasy Points, Josh Chevalier, pointed out to me. I forget which site it was on, but they asked Trey Richardson, like, hey, what guy, is there a guy that's played for Jeff Brom in the past that people have compared you to? And his answer was Rondale Moore, obviously a very steep comparison because of how good he was back in the day at Purdue. But that was the one slot receiver, right? That was the guy that broke that mold of the wide receiver 1 streak under Jeff Brom. So you obviously take note of that. And Jeff Richardson, or Trey Richardson, I would say is a probably top 7 round receiver at this point.
Yeah, you know what? I'll piggyback off of that. I'll jump around because we tried to find some different names right here. And so Luke Conholtz, for me, the quarterback for Louisville, is a name that's rising up my list a little bit. And I think a lot of it in part has to do with, you know, one, we're getting reports Isaac Brown's, you know, kind of banged up, and there can be, you know what, we know when he's healthy, he can be really good. You've got Keywan Brown as well, but you get in reports that Kindholtz could be used a little bit more in the running game. And then you couple that with the fact that Richardson's kind of creating that separation and becoming that playmaker at wide receiver one. And when you look at historically at, quarterbacks in that system, to your point, when they have that proven wide receiver one, it makes the starting quarterback that much more valuable from a fantasy football standpoint. Not always, but if you're going to give me some more, if you're going to tell me that Kindholtz is going to be used more in the running game, and you've got that clear-cut wide receiver one that's a playmaker that can get the ball in the end zone in the passing game, all of a sudden now the fantasy value of Kindholtz at the quarterback position with that possible extra running ability to add on, to me, increases his value. So again, he's not a top 25 quarterback for me from college fantasy football, but a player that has risen up my draft board that I'm getting as maybe my QB4 on my bench right there, knowing that there's some possibility and value moving up the board for me.
Yeah, I think what's intriguing about Kindholtz is that I mean, that's how he was used at Ohio State when he got in sparingly, was as a runner. He's a pretty good athlete. And I think what's intriguing there is that you look at last year and Miller Moss had negative 65 rushing yards,
Yeah.
but 9 rushing touchdowns. So if you get 9 rushing touchdowns from Kindholtz, and he's probably then on 54 carries is what Miller Moss had.
Yeah.
He
He's
could probably rush
a couple of hundred yards rushing with 7 or 8 touchdowns on top of what the passing can be. There's value there.
Yep.
That's bonus points.
Yep. Just a guy, I haven't drafted a ton here, but I put Micah Hudson from Texas Tech as a riser. And maybe it's just the social media page, because I feel like I'm seeing a highlight reel, catch from Micah Hudson every single day. But I mean, this is a former 5-star, and it just sounds like he's putting it together at this point. I was reading a recent article. They did list off Kenny Johnson, the Pittsburgh transfer, who will absolutely be in the mix, right? But they described him more as a vocal leader. And the writer who wrote the article did say that, like, they're not going to be surprised if Micah Hudson leads the team in stats, like receiving stats. So that's a guy who was essentially free at the start of the offseason because he's done nothing to this point. But, just all these positive reports, you just throw it in as a wide receiver 6, back end of the draft, and it costs nothing. Now, I will say this: what does the wide receiver 1 for Texas Tech actually mean? It might not mean a whole lot, right? Because we do know this offense is going to be good, but they absolutely spread it around last year. No receiver had more than 7 touchdowns. They didn't have more than 19% of the target share. So, it's not a guy that you're absolutely going to prioritize. That you can lean on as your wide receiver 1 or 2 every single week, but throw it in as your last final drafted wide receiver.
I like that name because I think if there's a player on the offense, a receiver in that offense that has the highest ceiling, that's him, right? You've got Coy Eakin. They brought in Johnson from Pitt. You've got Terrence Carter at tight end. You've been talking about using Jacoby Williams in as a slot receiver. So there's a lot of balls that could be thrown around there to a lot of different players. But to your point, I think if there's one receiver on the roster that is that receiver that maybe has next level talent, it could be Micah Hudson, right?
Yeah. So I was just going to close that out with the recent report I read was that Coy Eakin is not practicing right now. He doesn't have pads or anything like that. I think he has his jersey and helmet, but there's kind of some ambiguity as to his status right now.
Yeah, I think for me, next name I'll go into is Jamari McClure, running back at Tulane. And there's a couple of things that I'll get into the why behind this. And I know he was, he kind of flashed that talent at the end of last year. So again, a player using late season performance as a springboard into the next season. But the thing that I caution with most people as well is, and this is something you and I have spoken about in off air, is that there's some people out there that talking up that Tulane could possibly be the non-power representative in the college football playoff. I'm, as somebody that kind of lives near Tulane and follows a lot of the local news and tidbits down here, we do have to put in perspective that Tulane is coming off of 2 really good coaches. You had Fritz and you had John Sumrall. And the chances of them finding a third person as good as those two coaches, I don't feel the confidence that they've done that. I'm not really sure with what Tulane has around McClure that there's a lot that Tulane is going to make a run like they have been able to do in years past. And then you get coupled with the injury now where we know he's got a little bit of a foot injury and I think they've come out and said that it's not like he's even going to be ready for a game like for Duke, right? And so we know that he's most likely not going to be ready for week 1. And whenever you tell me a player's not going to be ready for week 1, I start to be concerned on whether or not they're even going to be ready to go full go by week 2 and week 3 because they're missing out getting the conditioning and the rigors of preseason camp. So for me, Jamari McClure, a guy that's kind of fallen on my radar on my draft board.
Yeah, it sounds like he's going to miss Duke game, the week 1 game against Duke at this point. And I like how you mentioned, like, yeah, he could be back week 2, but they're not going to give him probably a full workload, right? He's got to ramp up and get back into the swing of things. And you just read kind of the reaction to the McClure injury, and it talked about the depth that Tulane boasts in that backfield, whether it's Johnny Daniels, the Mississippi State transfer, bring back Maurice Turner, Jalen Lucas, a Florida State transfer, pretty electric there. So just the fact that they have depth, we talked about this yesterday when the news came out. Like, it's not just a Duke game; they have a week 3 game against Kansas State too. So not obviously a P4 opponent. So yeah, we dropped.
Well, the thing to consider too, you're looking at McClure, which I think both of us had in the 20s, right? And with running backs being heavy off the draft board in drafts this year, a running back between 20 and 30 could be coming off the board as early as the 3rd round. And so I just don't know if I'm spending 3rd round draft capital on McClure if there's the possibility of him missing as many as 3 games right now. That's all.
Yeah. Yeah, I'll go to a riser here that I listed, Roderick Robinson from UAB. He started the offseason probably drafted as in round 14 or 15. And as of this past week, I've seen him drafted as high as round 7. So you're getting him people are drafting him as their RB3, maybe your flex option. And I'm starting to feel really comfortable with that. They brought in multiple transfers, but all the reporting is that Roderick Robinson is the guy in that backfield. 235 pounds. Most importantly, he's healthy. That's why he did not see the field much at Georgia and probably why he transferred, right? He's out of the rotation there. But, this is a system. They will split it a little bit, but you're consistently seeing that starting running back get 150, 160 carries. They are really involved in the passing game. I think 90 combined receptions over the last 3 years from the running back 1. And, just the fact that, he's healthy, I think is most important here. He's getting positive buzz early on in fall camp from coaches and teammates alike. And it just kind of the point that I wanted to make was, you're heading into these drafts. Do you want a solidified running back 1, or do you want to draft sure, you got the big names of Texas who we covered in the last podcast, but you can throw out Roderick Robinson for the most part each week.
Yep.
You would feel comfortable with that versus maybe a P4 situation like a Texas, like a Penn State, maybe where it's just, it's going to be a rotation. I personally want that G5 running back. And that's going to get the consistent volume over maybe a bigger name at a P4 school.
Yeah, what's interesting now that you say that, as we get into the next week, there's probably going to be more names that we can add to this list, right? I mean, around the country, we're kind of offering some of these tidbits just based off of in most programs. They've only had 1 week of practice so far, right? So some of them just opened up camp this week. Unless they're in the week 0 game, they've been in camp for a couple of weeks. So there's a good chance we kind of record another show next week, and there's going to be some additional names that we're going to be moving up and down the charts, because the next one that I'll throw out is kind of a riser and a faller. They go hand in hand, and it goes back to 2 names that you and I have been kind of going back and forth with. since spring, since we did the preseason fantasy draft guide. And it's at LSU running back, where we opened with Harlem Berry at running back 1, and we've made the swap to Dylan Jones now at running back 1 and dropped Berry down to 2. So Berry's now the faller with Jones now the riser. And this was something that you were on in the spring, had it under the microscope as well. And I remember you coupled this with the news last year where Berry came in as one of the highly touted, highly recruited running backs across the country. And I said, look, I know the high school landscape down here. This is a guy that played at the lowest classification. He was running against 175-pound defensive linemen. He wasn't playing against the big boys. And then he goes into the SEC and he's got SEC type talent, but it was just a different level that he was playing against. Not saying he's not going to fulfill where the talent level, that he possesses, but Jones coming in from Wisconsin, a program that's known to traditionally pound the rock with the running back. Running backs there really get a good crash course. And Dylan Jones was a name that was making a name for himself in the spring, the summer workouts, and now as we get into preseason camp, Mike, we're still seeing and hearing his name, and it feels like that just the tea leaves are reading that Dylan Jones may wind up opening up the season as the Tigers RB1. At least that's the feel, and that's why we've made the switch, and that's why I've got Jones as a riser and Berry as a faller.
Yeah, I think how many times we've done this a long time. How many times have we seen a name pop in the spring and then everybody gets all giddy like, man, this guy's gonna be awesome, and then you get to fall camp and it just kind of either it stabilizes and it comes back to level water, or it just that name doesn't pop anymore. That's why we made the official move to Dylan Jones and boosted him up our rankings, because it was consistent throughout the spring, and now it's consistent throughout the first 2 weeks of camp for LSU.
Yep. What else you got?
Yeah, I got a faller here, but I'm starting to change my tune just a little bit. It's Jaquari Lewis from Appalachian State. He started the offseason, as a RB2, RB3 in most people's drafts. They were going as high as the 5th round. Obviously showed immense potential last year, had multiple 100-yard performances. There was one game against Marshall where Lewis had 33 carries, and I think he had 22 carries the next week. So this coach, he can handle a heavy workload. The coaches weren't hesitant to give him a heavy workload, but everybody was thrown into a loop when Phil Steele listed Jaquez Cross, the Arkansas State transfer, as the running back 1 for Appalachian State, and his ADP obviously plummeted from there. Here, is it an overreaction, right? Jaquez Cross never really did a ton at Arkansas State. He was mostly in a committee at the time that he was there. So maybe is this an overreaction on our part? Dowell Loggins, that coach, he's shown that he's willing to give his running back 1 a heavy workload. And I think it's a good buy low opportunity. Most recent draft, he went in round 12, which is I think very reasonable to select a potential RB1 at Appalachian State there. I will say, I'll conclude with this. Before this show, I looked at the 247 site. The Appalachian State writer there does have access to practice, and I'll quote him. He said, "Plenty of candidates at the running back position, but outside of Lewis, nobody else has been bringing the wow factor." So again, does it mean, that Lewis is going to get 300 carries? No, but just where we don't get a lot of information, you like to hear those little tidbits that at least Lewis is impressing, or nobody else is impressing to where he should be locked into a starting role.
Yeah, my next name is a little bit too that's just gotten some glaze over the past few days, and it's just Usman Chroma, the running back at Florida State. They bring in Trey Wisner from Texas, and it's not like Chroma has climbed up my draft board, but I like when we start getting some news of clarity in camp a little bit, where there may have been a little bit of where we're of uncertainty, and I'm still on the fence on whether or not Florida State is really going to be good at all anyway, because I think Norvell is really on the hot seat, right? Because he has to really turn some things around. But it feels like Chroma's picking up a little bit steam as we get closer to the season. And I like that separation for him in the Florida State backfield. And again, don't have him as a top 30, top 40 back, but he's climbing up my draft. These are the type of things that happen as we start getting some good news on some players. They start separating from some of those handcuffs that we may have associated with them in some of our draft prep.
Yeah, there was that good quote that came out yesterday, which you referenced that, he's going to get 15 to 20 carries this year. I will note that Trey Wisner has been out of practice, but is expected back. So you want to see if that, consistent reporting continues later on in fall camp.
Yep.
I'll close it out here. Keelan Russell is a slight faller for me. And it really stems from that article from 247, maybe a week or two ago, where the beat writer there predicted that that Austin Mack would be the starting quarterback this year. Whether that's the case or not, I don't know. Obviously, there's still a ways to go in that competition. Ryan Grubb, the offensive coordinator, said there's been no separation amongst the two. We should get some clarity Thursday, I believe, is the Alabama's first scrimmage. So we'll absolutely be, looking for that intel and information about that scrimmage. But just a couple. Obviously, with that article, people kind of backed off a little bit. He went as a round 10 selection to a round 12 selection in two drafts that I did most recently. So, people backed off just slightly. The one thing, and people who listen to the Fantasy Points podcast with me and Josh, they'll hear this story. I don't know if you saw this. There was a video at Alabama Media Days where Keelan Russell was taking a picture in front of the cameras, and all of his teammates gathered around him to be in that picture, right? You didn't see that same type of, admiration about Austin Mack, or I shouldn't say admiration, but like you didn't see a video of teammates flocking around Austin Mack too. So again, you just kind of, whether it's right or wrong or inaccurate or accurate, like you just see this type of stuff and you're just like, man, teammates really like Keelan Russell.
Gravitating towards him, yeah.
Like, yeah, I'm going to, maybe that's a leg up or a notch in the belt for Keelan Russell there. So
yeah, I like that one. And I'll throw out one that's something, this is one that you and I discussed this week based on some recent news. But again, we're going to base it on the consistency that we've gotten. And back in the spring, we're going to go with Liberty running back here, right? Remember, Evan Dickens last year, is it Evan Dickens, right? Yeah, he had over 200 carries last year. Let me see. Had written down 1,300 plus yards, 16 touchdowns, right? So we know what that RB1 can do in that Liberty offense. Now, coming out of spring, we were reading reports that Peyton Jones was a really a running back to watch in that offense, right? But we knew Kanye Udo, who had a big year at Army a couple of years ago, transferred to Arizona State last year, now transferred to Liberty. We have him pegged as that RB1 in Liberty's offense. He's kind of taken he's a little bit of a faller for me because once again, we watched another video where Peyton Jones is getting recognized for being one of those guys in camp that are just bringing it, showing consistency, and has been a performer. And now we've got spring indications, and now we've got preseason camp news as well that Peyton Jones is on both of those lists. And like you mentioned, as we get more and more information around the context with those type of, that type of context around those players, the deeper we get and the more news we hear, the more confident we start getting in the player that we're hearing about. So for me, Peyton Jones is a guy that's kind of up, and Kanye Udo might be a guy that's sliding down my board a little bit, because here's the key. There's an A back and B back in that offense. And so the key is, we had heard reports in the spring, Jones can play either that A back or the B back. The thing is when you look at the running back spot last year with Dickens, he got over 200 carries. Ethan Vasco, the quarterback, I think ended with 100. The next best running back only, I think, had 50 rushing attempts in that offense. So if you get the RB1 for Liberty, you're sitting on a guy that could be a weekly starter for you in your college fantasy lineup.
Yeah, that's an upside play. And it was interesting that if you listen to the video, he mentioned Peyton Jones, and then the coach Jamie Chadwell was like, "Oh, but then he fumbled though, so we need we need better out of Peyton Jones." And then there was a subsequent video where they mentioned Cam Davis, a Florida State transfer, basically like they called him a bowling ball or something to that effect. Where maybe I think they're doing like red zone work, and they gave him, or he got a rushing touchdown. So it's going to be a very interesting competition. We'll see if we get any clarity. We know the upside, right? Quentin Cooley, Evan Dickens.
It's just to get on the radar right now because that's one of those positions where that RB1 gets such a heavy volume. It's going to be worth monitoring that running back race.
Yep, absolutely.
So that's going to do it, man. Look, quick hitters here. We're done 3 shows this week, man. And look, we'll continue to do this next week because after next week, we probably start getting some things ready for week 0. We'll still be moving our boards around when it comes to preseason rankings and preseason news because there's a lot of drafts that happen up until week 0. But starting next week, we'll start having one eye on week 0, one eye on week 1 as we still finish up a lot of the preseason stuff. So that's going to do it for this week's show. For the last show of the week, risers and fallers, for my partner, Mike Bainbridge. My name's Joe DeSalvo. We'll see you guys when we start out the next series next week.